Jeanne Morel once believed she had married her soulmate. In the early years of their marriage, she and her husband Brian Morel shared dreams, laughter, and a bond she thought was unbreakable. But lately, cracks had begun to split through their once seamless partnership. Brian seemed to always be upset, distracted, and withdrawn. Nights that used to be filled with soft conversations turned into Brian scrolling endlessly on his phone, angled away from her. He no longer kissed her forehead before leaving for work. Instead, he rushed out with a cold, plus tard. Jeanne forced herself to ignore the ache forming in her heart, telling herself that every marriage goes through rough patches. She prepared his favorite meals, left love notes on the bathroom mirror, and waited up late for him to come home, only to be disappointed every time the door opened and his face showed irritation instead of warmth. As she sat alone on their living room couch, watching the minutes tick by, she wondered if he even remembered the dreams they once shared. Jeanne tried to confide in her best friend, Amber Lefebvre, who noticed the sadness hiding in Jeanne's eyes even when she tried to smile. They met often in a small cafe near Jeanne's bakery job, where Amber listened intently, leaning forward with concern as Jeanne described Brian's odd behavior. He had become overly secretive, taking private calls, deleting messages, and claiming he was too tired for intimacy. Jeanne brushed off the warning signs, convincing herself that stress from work must be the cause. Yet deep down, a gnawing intuition whispered something darker. Even her younger brother, Daniel Marchand, who adored Brian like a brother, noticed the growing tension whenever he visited. Jeanne held tight to hope, believing that love could fix everything. But as nights grew colder and Brian's affection disappeared, she wondered if hope alone was enough to hold on to a man who seemed to be slowly slipping away from her life. The next few weeks only magnified Jeanne's growing anxiety. Brian arrived home later than ever, sometimes at midnight, reeking faintly of unfamiliar perfumes, and insisted it was from co-workers at events she was never invited to attend. Jeanne tried asking general questions, but Brian responded with irritation or outright lies. He snapped at her for touching his phone and stormed away when she asked about his new late projects. Every time she pressed, the distance widened. Jeanne took note of the nights he claimed to be on business trips, only for Amber to later discover no such trips existed through the company contacts she managed. Jeanne's heart raced with fear at the thought of betrayal, but she forced the idea down, refusing to believe her husband could hurt her that deeply. She had promised loyalty, patience, and devotion, and she lived by those promises every day. One evening, Jeanne saw Brian dressed in a perfectly tailored suit she had never seen before, adjusting his tie in the mirror with a smug expression. When she asked where he was going, Brian muttered something about a formal client dinner and hurried out the door. Jeanne watched from the kitchen window as he got into a sleek black car she didn't recognize. The vehicle sped away, leaving Jeanne with a sinking feeling that became harder to silence. She called Amber in desperation, her voice trembling as she confessed her fears. Amber urged her to investigate before blindly trusting a man who clearly no longer respected the home they built. Daniel, too, after overhearing one of Brian's rude responses, told Jeanne she deserved better than constant uncertainty. Jeanne wiped her tears and tried to sleep that night, but the pillow felt like a cold reminder that she might already be alone in her marriage. On a rushed Thursday morning, Brian stumbled around the bedroom, tossing clothes into a single suitcase. He barely spoke to Jeanne, only muttering that he had a critical business conference in Nice and needed to catch his early flight. Jeanne offered to help him pack, but he pushed her aside, snapping at her for folding his shirt incorrectly. His phone buzzed repeatedly, flashes of a woman's smiling photo briefly appearing before he tilted the device away. Jeanne pretended not to see, though her pulse quickened. When Brian finally rushed out the door, slamming it behind him, Jeanne stood in silence, the echo haunting her like a final warning. She glanced down and spotted a smaller essential suitcase he always took when traveling, filled with his important documents, medication, and chargers. Panic seized her. He absolutely needed it. If she didn't act fast, he would miss crucial belongings. In a frantic whirlwind, Jeanne grabbed the suitcase and her car keys before racing toward the airport. Every red light felt like an intentional delay from fate itself. She rehearsed a smile, convincing herself this small gesture might rekindle affection between them. Maybe seeing her effort would remind Brian of her loyalty and care. Maybe he would thank her, apologize, even smile again. As she parked and hurried through the bustling terminal, hope bloomed weakly inside her chest. She scanned the departure screens, breathless, and rushed toward his gate. The crowd felt overwhelming, but she kept searching for her husband's familiar silhouette, anything to feel like she still mattered in his life. Little did she know she was seconds away from having her worst fears confirmed. Jeanne finally spotted Brian, standing with his back toward her. Relief washed over her briefly, until she saw another figure step closer to him. A young, elegant woman with striking features and flawless makeup embraced him. Brian's hands rested on her waist in a way he had not touched Jeanne for months. Jeanne froze, her breath caught painfully in her throat. She forced herself closer just in time to hear Brian laugh, a soft, affectionate laugh he hadn't shared with her in ages. The woman whispered something into his ear, and he pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers before placing a tender kiss on her lips. Jeanne felt her entire world collapse inside her chest. The crowd blurred around her as the truth struck with violent clarity. Brian wasn't stressed. He was in love, just not with her. Tears threatened to spill, but Jeanne clenched her fists, fighting to stay composed. She watched as Brian held the other woman's hand, walking confidently toward the boarding gate, like a man leaving a bad memory behind. Jeanne stepped forward, calling out his name weakly, "Brian?" But the airport noise swallowed her voice. She saw the woman's boarding pass as she adjusted her scarf. Erica Dubois. Jeanne's knees almost buckled. The name felt like venom. Proof her husband had replaced her with someone who wore confidence and seduction like perfume. Jeanne took one trembling step back, hiding behind a column before either of them noticed her. She stared at the small suitcase that suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was happening right before her eyes, cruel and undeniable. Desperate to understand the full degree of the betrayal, Jeanne waited until the couple disappeared to the security gates before approaching the check-in desk. Her hand shook as she pretended she needed information about her husband's reservation. What she learned was the sharpest strike of all. Brian had booked a one-way ticket to Nice. Not round-trip. A one-way escape from their marriage. Jeanne staggered back from the counter, nearly dropping the suitcase. Her husband hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been planning to vanish from their life, leaving her behind like she was nothing more than a discarded chapter. Jeanne rushed back to her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was caving in. She had spent sleepless nights worrying about him, cooking his favorite meals, defending him to others, while he prepared to replace her entirely. The humiliation burned deeply. But beneath the heartbreak, a new emotion began to stir. Determination. If he could betray her so easily, what else had he done behind her back? She would not collapse and let him erase her existence. Jeanne promised herself that this would not be the end of her story. It would be the beginning of her fight. Once home, Jeanne tore through desk drawers, filing cabinets, and any place Brian kept important papers. She uncovered disturbing evidence. Recent withdrawals and transfers from their joint accounts she never authorized. It wasn't just money he was taking. He was funneling everything into unknown accounts. She found sale agreements for a piece of property she inherited from her late grandmother, the one asset that meant the world to her. Her signature was forged, sloppy, but legally passable. Shock, fury, and betrayal twisted together so intensely she felt physically ill. Brian had not only abandoned her, he planned to leave her penniless. Jeanne called Daniel, her brother, begging him to come immediately. He arrived in minutes, his face turning dark with anger as he analyzed the documents. Daniel wasn't just protective. He was skilled in cybersecurity and financial tracing. With Amber joining them shortly after, the three formed an unexpected investigation team. Daniel traced Brian's transfers to offshore accounts in Monaco and Cyprus. Amber helped Jeanne contact a bank to freeze the joint accounts before Brian accessed more funds. As Jeanne dialed each number with shaking fingers, she vowed that if Brian wanted war, she would not lose. It didn't take long for Brian to notice he had been cut off financially. Jeanne's phone buzzed violently, his name flashing across the screen like a warning. The moment she answered, his voice exploded, dripping with venom and fake outrage. "What have you done, Jeanne? How dare you touch the accounts that fund my work?" he screamed. Jeanne steadied her breathing, her voice calm but firm as she replied, "How dare you steal from me? You lied, you cheated, and you plan to leave me with nothing." Brian stuttered, then tried to manipulate her with a sickeningly sweet tone, insisting she misunderstood everything. But Jeanne no longer believed his rehearsed excuses. Brian then shifted to threats, warning her she would regret interfering with his money. Jeanne almost laughed his money. She reminded him the assets were hers just as much, if not more. Before hanging up, she said something Brian didn't expect. "Whatever you planned, Brian, it ends now." Brian paused, stunned, before finally asking, "How much do you know?" Jeanne responded with a chilling statement. "Enough to destroy you." Then she ended the call, her finger trembling, but her resolve stronger than ever. Minutes later, Jeanne's phone rang again. This time the caller ID held a name she recognized from the airport. Erica Dubois. Jeanne's stomach knotted. She hesitated, but answered. Erica's voice was dripping with wicked triumph as she mocked Jeanne, describing how Brian chose her because she was more exciting, more beautiful, more deserving of luxury. Jeanne clenched her teeth, swallowing the urge to break down. Erica then taunted her further, saying Brian only stayed with Jeanne to drain the last of her wealth before disappearing forever. Every word sliced deeper, confirming the darkest truth. Brian and Erica wanted not only her heart, but her entire future destroyed. But Jeanne refused to give Erica the satisfaction of hearing her cry. Instead, she answered calmly, "You'll both regret underestimating me." Erica laughed cruelly, claiming Jeanne had nothing left but broken pride. Jeanne hung up, shaking not from weakness, but from rage and newfound power. She realized the enemy wasn't just a cheating husband. It was a calculated duo driven by greed, and Jeanne would not be their victim. Fueled by betrayal and cold justice, Jeanne collected every document, screenshot, and bank statement she could find and sought legal counsel the next morning. Me, Lawrence Fournier, one of the city's most respected divorce attorneys. Listen attentively as Jeanne detailed months of lies, forged contracts, and financial schemes. The lawyer's eyebrows lifted at the severity of Brian's crimes. "This isn't just divorce," she said gravely. "This is fraud, forgery, and marital theft." Jeanne felt both horrified and vindicated. She wasn't overreacting. She had been trapped in a marital scam. Fournier moved swiftly, filing a motion to freeze all remaining assets and secure Jeanne's inheritance under emergency legal protection. Divorce papers were drafted that ensured Jeanne would keep her financial rights. With every signed document, Jeanne felt a piece of her strength return. She wasn't just saving herself. She was reclaiming her dignity. As she left the office, folders in hand, she whispered a silent declaration to her heart. "Je suis prête. I am ready." The war Brian started, she would finish. Days later, Brian returned home, furious beyond measure. He barged into the house, slamming doors like a raging storm, demanding answers. Jeanne stood at the dining table, waiting calmly, divorce papers laid out like a battlefield map. Brian glared at her, accusing her of madness, betrayal, and ruining his life's plans. Jeanne met his anger with fearless eyes. She pointed to the documents, then to the evidence stacked beside them, bank statements, forged signatures, photos from the airport. Every lie he told was now exposed under cold, harsh truth. Brian's bravado cracked as he realized he couldn't escape. Jeanne gave him two choices: sign the divorce and walk away silently, or contest it and face prison for fraud. For the first time, Brian looked scared. His voice trembled while Erica's name slipped from his excuses, revealing how deeply entangled he truly was. Jeanne didn't flinch. She had bled enough for a marriage he discarded long ago. She pushed the pen toward him, stating clearly, "You don't get to destroy me." Brian stared at her. This wasn't the woman he thought he could manipulate. Jeanne had risen stronger than ever, and the battle he expected to win was now his greatest downfall. Brian's breathing grew heavy as he stared at the papers in front of him. His once confident posture shriveled under the weight of the consequences Jeanne laid bare. He snatched the pen angrily, clicking it repeatedly like he could intimidate her with sound. But Jeanne didn't flinch. She stood tall, arms crossed, eyes firm and unmoving. He scanned the documents again, digging for loopholes, but Daniel and Fournier had crafted everything meticulously. There was no escape, no money left to manipulate, no love left to exploit. Jeanne caught him glancing at the stacks of evidence again, the photos of him kissing Erica at the airport, the forged signatures, bank transaction logs, and the one-way ticket. Every piece stabbed deeper into his guilt. After a painful silence, the pen finally scratched paper. The moment the last signature landed, Jeanne released a slow, controlled breath, realizing she had just severed the last chain tying her to destruction. But Brian wasn't done. He shoved the pen across the table and spat bitter words, accusing her of being ungrateful, cold-hearted, and vindictive. He lunged toward her, but Daniel stepped between them. His expression a threat Brian knew better than to test. Jeanne simply watched with detached calm, almost pitying how powerless Brian had become. Her tears were gone, her heart protected. Once Daniel firmly escorted him out of the house, Jeanne closed the door gently, not in hate but in finality. The marriage that once defined her life was now nothing more than paper legally proving her freedom. She leaned against the door and allowed herself the smallest, trembling smile. She survived. It didn't take long for Erica DuBois to reveal her true colors. When Brian informed her that the financial well had dried up, that Jeanne protected every cent he planned to steal, Erica turned on him with venomous speed, gone with the soft kisses and seductive whispers. She ridiculed him for failing and called him useless. She mocked him for not being smart enough to secure the money first, for letting his wife, whom she insultingly called a plain little baker, outsmart him. Brian could only stand there, stunned, as his perfect new life burned to ashes before it even began. Erica packed her designer bags, which Brian had bought with Jeanne's money, and walked out of the hotel room that was no longer prepaid. She left him with nothing but his single suitcase, the one Jeanne had once rushed to save for him. The poetic irony stung. Brian, now completely abandoned, tried begging Erica, even offering promises he could never keep. But she was a woman of greed, not loyalty. Without wealth, he meant nothing to her. The door slammed. Silence followed. For the first time, Brian felt the weight of his actions. He looked out the window and saw his reflection, a man who destroyed the best thing he had for a fantasy that only lasted until the money disappeared. He realized Jeanne wasn't the weak one. He was. Meanwhile, Jeanne continued to rebuild her life step by step. She converted the once shared bedroom into her own sanctuary, donating Brian's leftover belongings to charity. She returned to work at the bakery with newfound confidence. Customers noticed her renewed energy, her genuine smile returning piece by piece. Amber proudly announced to anyone who asked that Jeanne was starting fresh and stronger than ever. Daniel visited often, making sure his sister never felt alone. Jeanne allowed herself joy again. She went out for brunch with friends, joined a fitness class, and walked by the river in the evenings, feeling the breeze heal her spirit. Although the heartbreak lingered, Jeanne chose not to dwell on the past. She kept reminding herself that betrayal did not define her. Her resilience did. She saved money, took financial planning courses, and even began writing a proposal to open her own bakery one day, one with a warm community atmosphere, where broken hearts could find comfort in fresh bread and kindness. Every new goal felt like a regained piece of identity. She no longer saw herself as Brian's wife. She was Jeanne Morel, survivor, warrior, and dreamer, and her new dreams belonged to her alone. News of the divorce and Brian's disgrace traveled fast through professional and social circles. His business partners distanced themselves immediately, fearing his reckless behavior and looming legal troubles. Invitations to elite gatherings vanished. His boss placed him on suspension pending investigation into financial misconduct. Suddenly, the man who once paraded his success couldn't get even a respectful phone call returned. Fake friends who once praised him disappeared like smoke. His reputation crumbled beyond repair. Brian finally understood the depth of his fall. He had traded respect for lust, loyalty for lies, and a solid life for a fantasy that couldn't survive reality. Jeanne, on the other hand, was handling herself with grace. She didn't speak ill of Brian publicly. She simply lived, letting truth expose his wrongs without her needing to lift a finger. And truth was a merciless exposure. People admired her courage and dignity. Amber joked that karma was finally wearing heels and walking with confidence. Jeanne didn't celebrate his downfall, but she took solace in knowing justice was unfolding on its own timeline. More importantly, she was rising while he sank. The legal aftermath grew more severe for Bryant. Investigations into forged signatures and fraud deepened, and he received official notices to appear in court. Jeanne cooperated fully with authorities, handing over all evidence. Fournier had organized. Her voice no longer shook when she spoke his name. She stood firm, demanding accountability for every crime he committed. Brian tried pleading with her one last time, begging her to withdraw the charges, tearfully claiming he still loved her and made a mistake. Jeanne's response was simple and final. You didn't make a mistake. You made choices. The judge granted Jeanne full protection of all her assets and rejected Brian's attempts to renegotiate terms. He was ordered to pay fines and restitution. But without money, that only increased his humiliation. Jeanne walked out of the courthouse with her held high, while Brian was swarmed by reporters seeking his downfall story. The tables had turned dramatically. Jeanne wasn't the abandoned spouse anymore. She was a woman who refused to be destroyed. Though justice had been served, healing wasn't instant. Some nights Jeanne still woke up shaking from nightmares, replaying the airport scene in her mind. Her heart still carried scars, but she learned to nurture her soul gently. Amber stayed by her side, reminding her that healing is not a straight line. Daniel encouraged her to focus on her bakery dream. Jeanne learned to enjoy her own presence, eating dinner alone with candles lit not for romance but for peace. She even joined a book club, where she found comfort in fiction and new friendships blossoming slowly. Jeanne also began therapy, a gift to herself that allowed her to process trauma without guilt. For the first time in a long while, she looked in the mirror and saw beauty, not pain. She realized she had survived something meant to break her, and that survival was proof of her strength. She vowed never again to lose herself in someone else's shadow. Never again would her life depend on someone unreliable. Her new chapter was forming, and she was writing every line with intention. Months passed, and spring breathed fresh life into the world. Jeanne was invited to a networking event for small business owners, hosted at a scenic rooftop overlooking the city. With Amber convincing her to go, Jeanne decided to step out of her comfort zone. There she met Mark Delacroix, a kind-hearted financial consultant with warm eyes and a gentle charisma that didn't demand attention, it earned it. They talked for hours, discovering shared passions for travel, good food, and ambitious dreams. Jeanne felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Mark didn't rush anything. He respected her boundaries and admired her resilience. He didn't try to fix her. Instead, he encouraged her to continue fixing herself. They exchanged numbers, and Jeanne left the event with a flutter in her heart she didn't expect. She wasn't falling in love. Not yet, but she was remembering that life could give second chances, if she dared to take them. With Mark's guidance and Daniel's support, Jeanne refined her bakery business plan. She secured funding and found the perfect small location on a lively street corner. The renovation process gave her joy, choosing soft pastel paints, wooden furniture, cozy lights, and a wall of handwritten affirmations encouraging others to rise after being broken. She named it La Renaissance, the rebirth. The grand opening attracted neighbors, friends, and even journalists impressed by her story of overcoming betrayal. Standing behind the counter in her new bakery, Jeanne greeted customers with genuine happiness. Every loaf of bread, every sweet pastry symbolized her healing. La Renaissance blossomed into a community favorite, a place where people didn't just eat. They felt. Jeanne's nightmare had transformed into purpose. Almost a year later, Jeanne walked through Charles de Gaulle Airport, but this time, not in tears. Her passport in one hand, her luggage rolling smoothly behind her. She was no longer the woman chasing after a husband who was abandoning her. She was a woman traveling by choice, on her own terms. Amber and Daniel accompanied her to the terminal, hugging her proudly as she prepared for a solo vacation to Greece, a gift she promised herself long ago. They captured photos, laughed, and celebrated her strength. Before boarding, Jeanne took one quiet moment to look around. The same type of gate where she once witnessed her world